Hi again. Welcome to our HMIS Street Outreach Workflow Training for projects that are funded by ESG or CoC grants. Excited to be here with you. I'm Andrea Carey from the data center side of the NCCEH, and we will be pursuing this version of Street Outreach today. I do want to let us know that today's workflow is specifically about those that are funded street outreach projects from our head sources, and we will have another training tomorrow, same time, different link for street outreach projects that are not funded or those other outreach projects. So there's a little bit of a range of flexibility if you're not funded. Do you want to make sure you are able to join us tomorrow? Okay, let's get started. We are going to start at the beginning with an overview of privacy in relation to our street outreach project. So as we know, our street outreach projects, you're really meeting people where they are, both emotionally, building that trust, and also physically. So you're going to need to be mobile, right? And part of that is making sure that you bring the right tools with you to establish that privacy conversation. So do want to make sure that as we're building our toolbox for having conversations with clients, as you build that relationship, you're bringing the right set of tools. So we basically need to take some of the documents that you would normally find in an intake room at a shelter or a permanent housing office and bring them with you. So that's going to include a copy of the privacy sign, a copy of the privacy notice, should someone request to see that, maybe a copy of the script if you want that to reference. We do recommend bringing a copy of our privacy options one-pager, which is for both clients and staff to go through and kind of describe a little bit better what those options are. You're going to want to bring multiple ROIs in case you're meeting multiple folks, and data collection documents. So your unsheltered first contact form or other documents to keep track of what you're collecting out in the field. And so this is a lot, and we might not use all of these resources with every conversation out on the streets, but you want to be ready, right? Because the building of the relationship with the client is going to be a little bit gradual potentially, but sometimes you're going to meet that client with that first contact where someone is ready to be connected, and you want to make sure you have the resources that they need to understand how HMIS works and what options they have for privacy, how we protect their information, and also how we coordinate across multiple agencies and projects. All of these documents are found on the data center's administrative page. I've got the link there on the screen. And so you can take a closer look at these documents there, but we do want to make sure that we're bringing this, and then also that we know some key aspects of these documents, right? We want to be really well versed in the privacy framework for the system. So a couple things that we really want to make sure to know before we go out into the field and collect information. We may need to explain things like the allowable uses that are listed in the ROI and the privacy notice. Remember that the ROI is that client-facing document which asks folks specifically to consent to a couple different sharing options, and the privacy notice is more in depth. It's a couple pages long to describe some of the allowable uses in further detail, outline some rights, and just a little bit more more detail and clarification on things. So allowable uses is strung between those, and we really want to make sure that we're clear on why we're collecting this information. And that includes coordination of services. So usually with our street outreach projects, this isn't the last stop for someone, right? We're trying to connect folks where they are to other services in the community. We need to coordinate to do that. We need to get them on the by name list. We need to work with permanent housing providers. Sometimes that's going to be your agency, sometimes it's not. So that coordination is definitely crucial. We also use information for funding, reimbursements, the reports for that. This is key to keeping your agency going. And as a funded street outreach project, it's really important to make sure we keep that funding continuing. So that is some of the uses to make sure that with your funders that you're spending the money on street outreach services. Admin purposes, like monitoring or auditing, just be really clear about, keeping things on track and in line is an important use of the data too. And the last main allowable use here is for de-identifying client information. So we want to make sure that we're able to de-identify and deduplicate information for clients and better understand a client's experience in the system. All right, we also really want to be clear about what is shared in HMIS, what are kind of the standard recommendations and what are the options for that. So in particular, it's really important to have a firm grasp of what is the standard information shared. This standard information is referenced in the ROI section 1 and includes each of these data elements: name, age or year of birth, gender, veteran status, and the last four of the social security number. All of this information is used to create a unique profile for someone in HMIS and make sure that we can tell each client from each other, right? This is to, the concept of a profile might be helpful in explaining this, that the client, we search for clients to see if they've already been served by another agency, and we use this information to confirm, oh yeah, this is the same person or not. So sharing this information is really helpful for coordination of services. We do also want to be really familiar with section 2 and 3 of the ROI. Section 2 is about sharing inside, sharing and visibility inside HMIS. So that would be more like sharing of current living situation with your coordinated entry project, making sure that there's that coordination for referrals in the system, potentially a shelter resource or most likely permanent housing. Section 3 is then talking about that community group that is meeting for coordination and just alerting the client that we really want to make sure we're being transparent, that some information is not just shared within HMIS, but we want to coordinate kind of in person or virtually, right, for services outside of that platform too. All right, so there are some tools to take with you to help explain this and might be helpful for you as well as the client. So our HMIS privacy options one-pager, outlines these different items, and it's an easy document to take. It is just that one page, tries to condense this and walk clients through the different options that they have, really framing it like that. It also does reference the automatic use and system security. So the fact that we're HMIS participating agencies means that this is our filing system, right? This is how we keep information and coordinate cases. But there are definitely some key protections for clients' information as well. And then just really outlining those sharing and visibility choices. Hopefully that's a little bit more condensed for a client. we've got the options broken out between sharing options in HMIS, and you can see here that screenshot of the ROI section 1, 2, and 3. And then, just really clarifying that depending on which options someone chooses, hopefully they, are willing to work with us and allow kind of the maximum coordination and sharing. But if not, there are some follow-up options for how much to limit information being visible to other partners. And so we also go through the basic options for within HMIS. What can we do to your electronic client file to hide information from other folks in the system?
Andrea, we do have a question in the chat. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, just saw that.
Awesome.
Cool. I see it, yeah.
Paul is asking, what if we're serving someone in the street ministry that's been in the emergency shelter project? Does this client get a separate client ID number in the system? You're on mute, I think. I can't.
Apologies. That's part of the reason why we are asking to share ROI section 1, right? That we want to share your basic information like your name, but also those other data elements we reviewed, so that we can search for folks. Because if we can't see a name or a date of birth or a gender, then it's really hard to identify someone. So just going back one more slide, these are those things that are potentially visible to other participating agencies to ensure that we get one client ID number per client. And that can really better serve the client then because we can connect those records and just understand the service history a lot better. Not to mention, it's easier in the community to securely talk about a client as a client ID. Yeah, great question. All right. So let's talk about if those options are used and if consent is not given. So if consent is not given for one of those sharing options, then we do need to lock down the visibility of a client's HMIS profile. And so there's two reasons that you may not have consent for street outreach in particular. The first is that you may not have had a privacy conversation with someone yet. When you're building that relationship, the first thing, probably not the first thing that you ask is, oh, can I explain this privacy framework about this database that is used by multiple agencies in the community and secures your data, but we use it as a data file. That conversation is maybe not the first thing you talk about. And so there may be a time period when you're working with the client, you're outreaching to them, that you don't have consent to share yet. And then the second situation where you may not have consent to share is if you had that privacy conversation and the client declines to share that information, right? So we can help at the data center. The basic step to respond to either of these situations is to write us, reach out to our help desk, and we can help you lock down the client profile appropriately. We do need to know if what specifically the client needs to have locked down. So if you haven't had the privacy conversation yet, that's going to be everything that needs to be locked down. And if it's just section 1 or section 2, then it's really helpful to specify that. We can really prioritize and accelerate that process when we're more specific in that request. Right. So for street outreach, privacy is a special concern for our clients that have been kind of potentially disconnected from other services and other resources in the community. So we do really want to take privacy seriously, make sure that we're transparent and clear in all the information we're talking to clients about, and also make sure that we're serving them the best way possible by explaining what security we do have, what privacy options we do have, and therefore how we can better coordinate and get folks those housing resources that they need and deserve. So don't see any other questions, Nicole. Just going to check real quick.
Nope, I don't see any other questions just yet.
All right. So let's go into more of the actual data collection with those privacy principles in mind. I want to start off with the data collection stages, just a reminder about when data entry really begins for street outreach projects. And again, this is for funded street outreach, right? So when we're funded street outreach, we need to follow the HUD requirements for our project type. And for that means that we are entering a project start into HMIS at the first contact between clients and an outreach worker. So that's really different than some of our other projects in HMIS where the services we provide are a bed or financial assistance for an apartment or navigation services. Outreach is kind of in recognition of that gradual building of trust. They want to, HUD really wants us to record all of that outreach effort that may or may not result in, a successful housing placement. Because y'all do a lot of work before maybe building that relationship enough to really get someone a solid referral, right? There's so much work and outreach and engagement that happens before you have a case plan with someone. And so by having a project start at that first contact, it's acknowledging that work, makes it billable too, right? And so we want to make sure that this is clear. We do a project start date with that first contact. So for street outreach, what this looks like is, you're having multiple contacts with a client. Here our fake client has a first contact in June, some medical supplies we provide for her a couple days later, maybe some hygiene supplies the following day, and then really solidify a housing plan and have that date of engagement. And so, sometimes we might think of someone as fully enrolled once we have that date of engagement, once we, have that housing plan, once we've had the privacy conversation. But our HMIS project start date is going to be that first contact. So it's going to be that June 1st date in this example. And that's because there's a lot of work that happens between that first contact and that housing plan, that date of engagement. All right, so that's a really key and unique thing about street outreach to keep in mind. So outlining the other kind of data collection stages and the steps for entering street outreach projects into HMIS. We've got it broken down here, but it is a little bit of it's a little bit of a repetitive process, right? As you're meeting and building that relationship with clients. So step one, nice and clear. You need to either find a client in HMIS, right? Searching folks, or create the client profile. Now, if you don't have a name to start with a client, then it'll probably be creating a client profile. But sometimes you meet someone, they're ready, you have enough identifying information to find a profile that already exists in HMIS and make sure that they keep that client ID. The second step is to create that project start on the entry exit tab and record that first contact. That begins the process of collecting and entering data. The next step is to add additional contacts. So as you're building that relationship and gathering more information, you're going to add those through interim updates as they happen. And then step 4 is recording the date of engagement, maybe through an interim update if it takes a few meetings. And that's once a client agrees to services. So again, I've mentioned this a couple times in passing. That date of engagement is once a client agrees to your street outreach services. That may be when they agree to a case plan or a housing plan. You'll know this also because this is when you might have that privacy conversation, right? So it's that point at which a client is kind of fully engaged in your work and services and project. Now, you may also find folks that are ready to go on day one. And so if a client does have, it is ready and wants to agree to services on day one, then you can record the date of engagement on that project start assessment. But this structure also allows you to add information over time. Okay, so that was kind of a theoretical overview. Let's go into how we actually collect this information and enter it into HMIS. So we're going to start with our first contact. Then we're going to go to some of those follow-ups and additional times you meet with the client, walk through what happens at the date of engagement, and then proceed from there to exits and the possibilities for a client. All right, so at first contact, this is where we're going to collect some data, work on engagement. We do want to collect as much information as the client is comfortable giving. So, you know, we've tried to identify that minimum information for kind of a meaningful first contact on a first contact form. But really, you don't have to have all of this information to have that first contact. So it's just as much as you can, as much as the client is comfortable giving. So ideally, again, not necessarily, but ideally, this means searchable information like name, date of birth, gender, maybe even social. That definitely helps us find other profiles in HMIS. So that is would be helpful. If you don't have that, you can create a profile and proceed there. We also really want contact information, right? You want to be able to meet up with someone later, at least a kind of general location, so you have those notes. Sometimes this first contact can be helpful. It can be helpful to know information for other referrals, such as veteran status or maybe domestic violence history. So potentially there's other appropriate sources for referrals and resources, so that information can be helpful. And then, of course, current living situation. What is their living situation? That's really key for street outreach. Current living situation for street outreach, almost always place not meant for habitation. That's why we're engaging with folks, right? But at this point, we might not, you might have to ask. So all this information is included on the first contact form as an ideal. Ideally, on first contact, we would get some of this information. Of course, you're welcome to go through an entire start and an intake if possible. It's you know, the right time to complete a VI-SPDAT assessment, that coordinated entry assessment, to make assessments for basic needs and also referrals. If we can get that referral in faster, given a client's needs, that's great. But we also understand the first contact might not be when someone is ready to go through the whole assessment. So this is the just this little picture here of the first contact form. So this has the kind of ideal minimum information for a first contact, and a little bit of a blurb here at the top for how to identify yourself and explain the purpose of your questions. Just a little bit of some guidance here to help you approach folks in your work. And then there's that location for identifying them as much as possible throughout that document. All right, so we hope that this first contact sheet or form is helpful in kind of highlighting what's really important, what's the ideal collection for that first contact in order to proceed successfully with the client. All right, so now the question is, well, how do we put that in HMIS? It's not everything, you know, for the intake, so let's take a look at that. As always, whenever we're entering data into HMIS, we really want to remember to check enter data as mode and backdate mode. So make sure you're in enter data as mode for the street outreach project. You're going to select that in the upper right-hand corner under enter data as mode, and then backdate to the actual date of your first contact with the client. Maybe that's the same day. Maybe you're super fast at data entry and that you know, you don't have backdate mode, but if it's not, you're going to want to backdate to the correct date. All right, and so once you're ready to enter information, you know, not everything is required at first contact, and so you want to record what information you have. It's possible that you won't have a name at this point, so you can use the description in the first and last name section. For example, here we used an identifying kind of physical trait. Spoke to a client who had a red umbrella, and it was at this location by an exit for I-40. That can help narrow down the client and help you kind of remember, oh yeah, it was that person. But it doesn't initially have to be their full name. So if you don't have a name, you can still enter them into HMIS, keep a record of your work and services, and bill for them, right? Bill for those services. So do remember to use the name quality dropdown, and this is going to be partial street name or code name reported if you don't have that full name at that first contact. And you are going to need to update the name on or before a date of engagement. So you can really think about that date of engagement as when everything needs to be entered in, but not yet at first contact. So there's a few places where you are going to enter the information you have. You may have information for the client record, including veteran status. You may have information for client demographics, including maybe an approximate date of birth, or maybe somehow gender, race, ethnicity identities came up. So if you have that information, enter that on your client profile tab as usual. And you may hopefully have some contact information. So on our client profile tab, there is a section, if you scroll down past third, fourth, fifth race options, and it says client contact information. You can click the add button and then add whatever information you have for them, whether that's phone numbers, you know, can you text, email addresses. We have a place for social media handle if that's how they connect. And then there is this text box for other contact method or frequent location. This allows you to say that a client is, you know, at this intersection if they're unsheltered and living outside in a specific location. You can also use that for a kind of third-party reference if, you know, maybe they don't have a phone, but maybe someone else in camp does, or another acquaintance. That can be used there as well. And so this can really help you stay organized with that contact information and, you know, support folks in your team too to be able to look that up as necessary. The other thing is that you can add multiple contact information, right? So this is one of those tables that we call sub-assessments. And so if you go and click that add button again, you'll get this same page here, and you can add another phone number, another email, another third party or frequent location. And you can just add that for as many pieces of contact information as you have. You know, for access to coordinated entry services, those referrals, it's just so important to have multiple sources of contact information, because our clients are, you know, maybe they don't have a consistent phone number, maybe they run out of minutes. And so it's really important, as much as possible, to get as many sources of contact information as possible and saved here. The other thing about contact information is we are going to be using that for our point in time count later this year. So that is just really helpful. Can't emphasize that enough. Get that in now. All right, so the next question we're going to ask ourselves at first contact is this client part of a household? If the client is an individual, skip that household tab, just go right on by. If the client is a household, you can add folks now, but most of our street outreach clients, at least what we've seen so far, have been singles, and so often you can skip the household tab, go right to the ROI or the entry exit tab. All right, and then just that reminder again that if a client has not given consent, we do need to lock this down. We use the term lockdown because there's an actual little lock icon that we negotiate with in HMIS. So do reach out to the data center and we can help you lock that down. If you're working with a ton of clients, we can, we can teach you about that, train you about that, but the easiest way to get this started is to reach out, let us know what ID needs to be locked down. And so that ROI tab, we may need to skip it at the first contact because the ROI has to be signed on or before that date of engagement, but it doesn't necessarily have to be signed or consent given at that first contact. So we want to respect the fact that we don't have the consent, lock it down. All right, so our project start does begin with first contact, as we've been emphasizing. And so you're going to be able to record a project start on the entry exit tab. Because I think all of our funding so far in our CoCs has been HUD. It's either CoC or ESG street outreach. You're going to be using the HUD option. But if you have different funding, you may need to use that. So if you were to get PATH street outreach funding, you would use the PATH option. And again, on this tab, we're also just recording what information we have after that first contact. So that is definitely relationship to head of household, right? When in doubt, someone is their own head of household. Definitely which county, the MC county of service. You should hopefully know which county you were in when you met them. Client location, what CoC are you a part of? And the outreach information, that current living situation, where are they staying, right? Presumably they're literally homeless. We're gonna, and then you wanna make sure you're scrolling through the assessment to check all of the potential information that you gathered during that first contact. Specifically, I wanna highlight that current living situation. This is a really important data element for street outreach projects. And so if you scroll down, you can see here, it's right after domestic violence history. And it's gonna be kind of highlighted with this header. This is also in the form of a sub-assessment, so it's this weird table, and you can click add for contacts in order to record where the client was staying, what was their situation when you first met them. The way that HUD interprets this element is that this represents different contacts with the client. So that is kind of the expectation from HUD, is that you had a first contact, and so you have a current living situation recorded. Let's take a look at what this looks like. There's a lot of questions here, but for street outreach projects, it's really simple to fill out. First, you have the dates at the top, and we're just going to go right down the line and complete the same dates for all of those sections here. Start date, end date, information date. We're just taking a snapshot of what the client's living situation was, so that's all going to be the same. And you can use that green checkmark icon to just enter that in real quick. The next question you go to is that current living situation. This is just like prior living situation, that drop down, and for our clients, it's going to be a place not meant for habitation right up top. And then finally, you're going to use living situation verified by, and this is where you're going to use a lookup tool that's a search engine to find your project. Unfortunately, right now, it doesn't just automatically go to what you're EDA'd as. So you're just going to have to type in your agency name or some of it, right? Just enough to be unique, and identify your project. All right, and then from there, you actually can stop. This next question is only for folks in living situations that are institutional, temporary, or permanent locations. So the question, is a client going to have to leave within 14 days? Doesn't apply to our clients because they're unsheltered. They're already eligible for our services. They're considered literally homeless by HUD. These follow-up questions determine if clients are Category 2 homeless. So we don't have to worry about that. All right, so after the first contact, a client is going to have an entry-exit tab that looks like this. So we're going to have our project start and a row there for our street outreach project. Okay, so just to recap first contact, we've gathered what we can, and then we try to find where in the HMIS workflow and structure of those different tabs to enter that information, from some basic identifying information and demographics on the client profile tab, maybe a household configuration, probably not, but maybe an ROI in that consent conversation. And then on the entry exit tab, starting that project start to kind of begin the clock on you serving the client. This is now, someone you're serving and spending that important outreach and engagement time with. Okay, any questions about how to start with clients? This is very different than some projects in HMIS. I want to make sure this is a good place to start. All right, and for coordinated entry, awesome, thanks, Nicole. And for coordinated entry leads on the call, this means that when you see an entry into a street outreach project on an entry exit tab, that could mean that that there's been a first contact and there's not maybe a lot of information about that client. So keep that in mind, that project starts are first contacts for street outreach projects, and the outreach worker may not have everything at their disposal to figure out what works for that client. Okay, let's go to second contact and beyond. So what do we do after we first meet a client, and how does that relate to what's in HMIS? So we're going to collect additional information. We're going to continue engaging. And as a client is comfortable, we're going to enter that into HMIS. You can use a supplemental contact form to keep some notes, or you can use our normal interim update and start forms as you're building that record for a client. I do want to note that for these additional contacts, HUD requires current living situation to be entered at least every 3 months. But really the best practice is at least once a month. So this is an expectation of, like, when you're meeting a client, we need to confirm, like, okay, are they still living in an unsheltered place, or what's happening? And so you want to enter a current living situation through an interim update. We'll show you how to do that. And this really provides an important record in HMIS of that experience of homelessness. So because street outreach is a, potentially infrequent interaction, it's periodic. You may see someone for several days in a row, and then you may not see them for a couple of weeks, right? It's important to record current living situation in HMIS to confirm, when you can, where someone is staying. This HMIS record for current living situation may be helpful in the future for things like a permanent supportive housing referral. If someone needs to confirm a number of months literally homeless, that record in HMIS can be used for that. And so the other thing about this is that HUD's expectation and definition of when a current living situation should be added is when a street outreach worker meets with the client about well-being or needs, about a housing plan in the office, or a referral to another service. So that's another guidepost for you in terms of when should you be entering a current living situation, when should you be recording additional information in the HMIS record. So best practice is at least once a month, and when you're having these significant interactions, as HUD mentioned. All right, and if it's not done already, definitely completing that coordinated entry assessment to assess those basic needs and make referrals is also going to be important. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have a supplemental form to help you with this. We're just publishing this. This is an outreach contact supplemental. And what it does is it kind of condenses the number of likely current living situations that you'll need to record for a client in street outreach. And it has a couple places where you can take notes, maybe a couple days in a row, so that you can build things over time, build that record over time. So this form kind of allows you to condense those notes for a client when the full array of options that could possibly be updated is not maybe as easy to use in the field. So there's a section here called contact notes, just kind of prompts you, okay, any changes, services provided, referrals made, follow-ups, just to give you a place to jot those down so you can then take that appropriate action and record it in HMIS. But we found that this was a request from folks to have a little bit of a condensed version for these updates. So that is available now. And again, just want to emphasize current living situation. According to HUD, should be collected at each of these different circumstances. So this is an important document to potentially have when you're having those meetings with clients. All right. If I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. Remember to check EDA and backdate mode whenever you're entering data into HMIS. So for these additional contacts, you're also going to want to check your enter data as mode. Make sure you're giving your street outreach project the credit of serving this client, right? So make sure you have that EDA mode and enter it for that project. Then we're going to add more information that's gathered at the next contact, right? So whatever you have at the next contact, we're thinking about this in a pre-date of engagement environment. If you learn things about the household, you can add information there. If you have a privacy conversation, add the record for that EROI on the ROI tab. And you can also edit the project start for things like homeless history, income, domestic violence history, etc. Street outreach is the only project type where information is added to the project start date. Added after the project start date. So just know that you as a street outreach project get a little bit more flexibility in terms of adding information you learn on an ongoing basis, because we know that you aren't going to get all 20 questions potentially in that first contact. All right, and we also so when you go to add that information to the project start, you're going to click the pencil, right? Pencil there, and just save and continue on this next pop-up. Be careful to not change the project start date. So we want to still record that your first contact was, let's see, in the screenshot, it was August 10th. So we want to make sure it stays that date so that everything that follows can, can be calculated for how long does it take to work with clients, and really show that you're developing a meaningful relationship that takes time. And then from there, you're going to want to edit the project start for, again, those important elements that you may learn over time, such as homeless history, income, non-cash benefits, domestic violence history, disabling condition, health insurance, all of that. So it's all listed out for you on that project start assessment, but we know it might be a gradual process to add that. All right, then you are going to want to add an interim to record that contact. So you're going to need to, once you save the changes to the project start, go to the interim section, add an interim review, identify that as an update type, and then scroll through the questions to make changes as appropriate, or maybe even add a date of engagement. Most often in these early contacts, you're just going to be updating current living situation and adding more stuff to the project start. So with current living situation, you can see here, this is a monthly contact for the client where we've been working with them since May, but we also met in June and July. And again, that date of engagement is going to be blank until it happens. So we keep adding these current living situations, keep adding these interim updates until we can fill in that date of engagement and beyond. All right, and then just again, on these additional contacts, don't forget to record more contact information as available. These contacts make it easier to find folks with resources once they happen. We know, the matching process can take a second. So once you get that resource that fits for that client, you really want to be able to move quickly. And having multiple contact options saved is going to be really helpful to do that. So here in the example, oh yeah.
Andrea, there's a request in the chat to show the last screen again.
Absolutely. Yeah, so this last screen is really, there we go, really showing the current living situation box when there's multiple interactions with a client, so you could have that building relationship documented.
I don't know, Jeff, if you had a specific question on this that you wanted to pop into the chat or come off mute and ask, or if you just wanted to see it again for a little bit longer.
I just wanted to see it again, looking at the seeing the different dates added in, just like each time you're coming in for one. I want to kind of implement that into some other things that we're doing as well. So that I wanted to see how it looks on the screen to be able to relay that to other workers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So here in my example client, I was meeting with the client at a monthly meeting, and so it was the same day of the month. Also happened to be easier for the training site picture, but you might have this varying, right? So the start date, but you can really have the start date be the same as the end date, be the same as the information date, just to confirm this is the snapshot of when we spoke to the client. Yeah, absolutely. So here, this is my same client. So we had a monthly meeting at a certain intersection community meeting, and the first contact information I was able to get was a phone that sometimes loses minutes. So a couple months later, or 1 month later rather, I was able to get the phone number of the community organizer that is having this monthly meeting that I've been able to connect with this client. So I have multiple ways to potentially reach out for the client, and I can keep adding to this contact information sub-assessment to save possible ways to get in touch with the client. All right, so all of this is building that trust and kind of building to this full enrollment, this date of engagement. And so again, dates of engagement can happen at first contact. Often with unsheltered clients, it takes a little bit longer to connect. So if it does take a little bit longer, you're going to just keep building that relationship until you have that date of engagement. And once you have a date of engagement, you need to confirm all information is correct. And we're going to first record the date of engagement on the interim. To make sure you're editing and backdating, go to your interims, add an interim update, and scroll down, update anything that needs to be updated, including current living situation, to make sure that living situation is accurate, and then fill in that date of engagement. The other thing you need to do, and for those of you who have permanent housing project experience, the date of engagement is very similar to a housing move-in date. It's just this date field, right, that you go to the interim to update. But there's another part to date of engagement, and that is that now a client is kind of fully enrolled, you've got a case plan, you've had a privacy conversation, you must have all of these tabs updated by the date of engagement or as of the date of engagement. So that means that all the demographics and client record information on the client profile tab, the household, if applicable, the ROI tab, making sure you record that you did have that privacy conversation and the results of that, and your project start must be complete. So you've kind of been backfilling the intake paperwork up until now, and then on the date of engagement, you really need to make sure that all of that is complete. So if any information,
sorry, we do have a question in the chat. For reports, does it include all project starts for numbers served or only the ones that have dates of engagement?
Great question. So dates of engagement are really important in HUD reports because that's when data quality starts being measured. So HUD is not going to penalize you for not knowing someone's name if you don't have a date of engagement, right? Because you're still building that relationship. And so the answer is that it will include everyone you served, but there are a couple specific questions that break out who's engaged and who is not. So I'll show you that in an example caper, just to show you how a date of engagement changes the record over time in those reports. So, because those are two different numbers, right? Like that, the number of folks you're outreaching in general is really important because case managers only have so much time in the day, hours in a week. So you can't be stressed too thin on how many folks you're working with. And at the same time, there's going to be more significant engagement and work with folks that have a date of engagement. So you're kind of actively pursuing those referrals and housing opportunities. Now, when you're completing the project start assessment here for any missing information, you can actually keep your backdate mode as is for that date of engagement and head back to your project start, that little pencil icon. All right. So date of engagement is really exciting. That's our kind of our pivotal moment where we're fully fully enrolling a client. We've got buy-in, we've got privacy consent. That's all great. But data collection continues after date of engagement. We're still going to be working with folks. We need to record referrals and continue to document their living situation for potential future referrals, right? So after a date of engagement, you're going to continue to use an interim update to complete information record that information for your next contact. And so it's a similar process there with using your interim on the entry exit tab to update information. It's just not quite as, there's some questions that only appear on the project start assessment because we only need to answer them once. So the interim update is just a little bit shorter there. And then the other thing is that clients can be exited without dates of engagement. So some clients are never going to fully engage in services. This may mean that the day of engagement is left blank for the whole time. And there may be some incomplete information on start and exits. This is still really important to record because it does allow that more accurate representation of the outreach workers' efforts. Not every outreach is going to be successful, but you want to make sure that you're able to show the work you did put in to reach out to folks and try to figure out what their eligibility is and potentially what services they're interested in. All right. One more note about the date of engagement and the ROI. I realized I forgot to mention this. When you get to a date of engagement, you may find that the client accepts and does consent to sharing and visibility for their information. And so if you've already had a profile locked down because you hadn't had that conversation and then that changes, you're going to need to reach out to the data center, identify the client ID and say, this is the community sharing that needs to be activated, or ROI section 1 and 2 are now fully consented to. Just a little bit of specificity there can go a long way to making sure that we're able to do that quickly for you. Okay, any questions about data collection and entry leading up to and after date of engagement? Not seeing any chats. All right, so let's talk exits. So exits are not quite as varied as starts, but there are also a few options. Street outreach is our special project type in HMIS. Exits can really happen two ways. So we can have active client exits or inactive client exits. Here are the different possible kind of categories for an active client exit. You might have a positive exit, which means connecting someone to shelter, temporary housing, or potentially permanent housing. That's definitely positive. There might be negative exits or unknown exits, unsheltered exits. You may just need to part ways because they're not interested in working with you anymore. And then there's things that are kind of outside the scope of positive or negative in terms of neutral exits to institutions. Someone needs a hospital, long-term, visit there. That's going to be that's not really housing related. They needed the hospital, or they didn't have a choice. They had to go to jail. Those are kind of other exits possibly that don't really contribute to like a positive exit rate. And then of course you may work with folks that possibly decease while you're or pass away while you are working with them, and so that's not something that is penalized or not. There are also inactive client exits, and so one common way is there's no goodbye. A client no longer is able to be found. They are inactive after 90 days without contact, so those are related. You might have local funding that specifies a need to exit inactive folks for a different time frame, but it's like at most a client could be not contacted for 90 days and need an exit. So that's our community standard 90 days, but you can exit folks sooner if you know
There
that
is
they're
a
inactive.
question in the chat. That they're asking if someone is currently staying at the shelter, should they be exited?
Yeah, great question. So it does depend a little bit. It's possible that you're no longer working with the client, right? Maybe there's a caseworker at the shelter that's working with them, or they're getting that coordinated entry referral to permanent housing, and so it's totally appropriate to exit the client when they enter a shelter. However, client eligibility is really assessed at start, right, at that date of engagement. And so the when you see services might be more specific to your funding type or your community needs. I don't want to be too specific because there's some guidance, but if you're ESG funded, there's the desk guide that really talks about when to see services with someone. So I would recommend that, but I do know of some other street outreach funding that really wants folks to work with folks while they're in shelter. And
Hey,
shelter,
Andrea.
Tricia.
Sorry, I was just going to mention this, which Danita's on our team too, and we've had this conversation, and I think it gets confusing sometimes. We often say, are we still doing things right? Are we helping people that maybe need to be exited? And I think, I'm not sure, I've talked to a couple different people, and I think the fact that in this specific, like in Henderson County, we don't have a shelter that's funded by any state funds, so they're just privately funded, and they don't actually have any caseworkers currently working. So I feel, I think we've decided that in that case, yeah, if they're in this shelter, they're still needing our services. We're still actively gonna work with them. But then, like in a different county, in say Transylvania, who is HUD funded, that would be a time when they could potentially not be a client. Like we can exit them from the street outreach project, but they would still be in that emergency shelter project within our continuum or the region.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So it can depend on the community and what resources are available to the client. But it's certainly appropriate to help a client get an even more positive exit. And we know too that length of stay at shelter can be a night or it can be much longer, right? So that really depends too.
And that's the other thing. If we know that so in order to exit them, if they're like in a institution or if they're going to the hospital or, if they're in jail, we need to confirm that they're going to be in there for 90 days or more. Is that right?
That's the basic guidance. So if a client is going to be in that institution for 90 days or more, I would exit them. You can always re-engage with them later, right? If should that be needed. But 90 days in an institution is significant for HMIS. Awesome. Okay, and I think there was another question in chat about the timeline. So if a client can't be found, if a client can't be found, what's the timeline for exit? The timeline is at most 90 days. If you don't see them for 90 days, you should definitely exit them. It's possible you hear another way that they moved out of state or they're not in your community anymore. So it's definitely possible to exit them before those 90 days, but at most 90 days should go by before you exit them as inactive. Does that answer your question, Paul? Okay.
Yes.
really good questions. Thank you so much. Street outreach is kind of one of those more nimble projects because the work you do is so important and varies. You're really trying to meet clients where they are. So really appreciate those questions. All right, so when we're looking at exits in HMIS, you're going to record this exit on the entry exit tab, make sure you're EDAing, make sure you're backdating, and then you click the pencil next to the exit date column. So remember that to exit a client in HMIS, you're going to use the pencil through the entry exit tab. Make sure that you select the right exiting information, so an appropriate reason for leaving, and the destination. Remember that reason for leaving is really driven by, did the program run as expected? That would be completed program, or did something else happen? Were they able to find housing on their own before you were able to refer them? There's an option for that. Is it that they totally disappeared? There's an option for that. And that's different from destination, which is where they're sleeping that night. So click Save and Continue, and then head over to the exit assessment information and just double check and make sure that all of this is correct and it doesn't need any updates. It starts off with NC County of Service, but of course, you can scroll down and confirm health insurance, income, etc. All right. So that's the full workflow for street outreach funded by HUD, CoC, ESG. We do have resources. So we have some street outreach resources. I want to make sure that we point you to the privacy documents, the data collection documents, and then there's a separate place on our website for workflow guides. And we did have a great training a week ago by my colleague Laurel on the principles of street outreach. And so I also wanted to make sure that was here. It's also posted on our website, so you can definitely find it there. What I'd like to do now is check in again on if there's any questions. And then if not, we can pull up the CAPER report and really look through look through that workflow and how you can see that and kind of monitor it in your reports. And I see that.
There's a question about getting a link to the resource page on the website. Oh, you sent it.
Yeah. No worries. I was just typing it out here. There we go. Absolutely. All right. So let's I'm just going to pause our share here. Nicole, we've got a chat, really good question about where is the best place to document the housing matrix in HMIS? Do you have a sense of that? That's an ESG documentation requirement.
The housing matrix? I was going to say, I'm not familiar with that data element.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I do try to stay away from giving guidance on ESG documentation just because that's not our expertise. Our expertise is really about the database and HMIS itself. There are options to utilize in HMIS in terms of you could upload a file attachment for the completed housing assessment matrix. So you could kind of keep it there. So that would be an option.
Yeah, I started to say that works.
Yeah,
my thing was just wanting to make sure that, like when we have audits and, the chart checks that you know, our folders, our paper documents are matching what we have entered into HMIS. And so if we send in the paper documents that reflect something on that form and then it doesn't reflect it in HMIS, I'm just curious as to, like, is there a better place, or is it just best to upload it, or yeah.
Great. Yeah, good question. So the ESG office will not anticipate that document being saved in HMIS. So while they may cross-reference the information within that, like that's an eligibility document, right? So they want to see like a current living situation that, you know, confirms the place not meant for habitation.
Okay.
But it's not going to, they're not going to like look for a file attachment. They're not going to look to a response that is specifically housing assessment matrix.
Okay. All right. That makes sense.
Cool. I will show you just briefly where the file attachment location is, just in case folks, other folks maybe don't know where that is. So if you go into Client Point, I'm going to pull up my fake client here, Marcus. And on the bottom of the client profile tab, right where you open up, you're going to be able to just scroll. You're going to be able to find that that file attachment sub-assessment. And from here, you can attach documents just as you would upload any documents online, have a description, and then save that. I wonder if I can find something innocuous to you. Here we go. Oh, how about now? I don't want to show you my whole scary downloads folder. But here's our privacy options one pager. Just uploaded this. And so you can see there's a date added, the name of the actual file itself, the description can be there, and then it also says who you were EDAing at. So that can be helpful. And that can be really helpful internally for agency coordination. You know, if you're working with shelters that is also at your agency or rapid rehousing, that can be super helpful because it is in HMIS and has that extra security there. All right, so let's just take a look at our report real quick. And I want to show you one thing. I'm EDA'd as the street outreach project, the state street outreach project from our agency Heading Home. And I ran this report twice today, so I'm going to show us what happened in between these polls. So for street outreach, depends on your funding, but you can definitely use the APR or the CAPER to run your project through and look for those outcomes, look for that data quality information. The prompts are the same as you would for any other CAPER. So if you're running it for one provider, you're going to want to make sure you're using enter data as mode for those best results. If you're running it for multiple providers, you can use reporting group and contact the data center if you don't see the group that meets your needs. Date range here, I just did kind of year to date from last September, and then entry exit type. This is mostly going to be HUD for folks on the call. If you have other street outreach funding from past, I don't think the VAs have street outreach funding right now, but those would be the two most likely other options, and then you can build that report. So I pulled this report earlier, and what we see here, just to kind of go back to the question about number of people served, is we see the total number of people served at the top in table 5A is 2. If I click on the blue number, I get that detailed list of my clients. These are fake clients. So I've got 2 there. And as we go down, we see there's actually no data quality errors. I know for a fact there's missing information on these profiles. And the reason for that is, we go down here to question 9A and B. So table 9A for number of persons contacted, table 9B for number of persons engaged. These are going to be key street outreach questions. So we have 1 contact recorded So this is one client with at least one current living situation, and that's going to be Marcus. And then we have 0 people that have been engaged. You see here that be. So these are folks we're working with. We're trying to get that date of engagement, but we haven't yet. And so using 9A and 9B in coordination with the total number of people served at the very top will help you better understand how many folks you're trying to work with and how many folks you're really working with those dates of engagement. So I did pull this report one more time when I added a date of engagement. You can see I just did it 2 minutes apart earlier today. Wanted to give us a quick reference point here. All right, and so I did add a date of engagement to my client, Roderick. And so once I added that date of engagement, you can see data quality is now being recorded. And so now he's coming up with issues for all sorts of things, you know, demographics, client profile, start information, like disabling condition in relationship to head of household. So those error rates only appeared after I did that date of engagement. Let's see. So hopefully that's really encouraging to folks because, you know, HUD is really giving you some time to collect this information. So you won't get penalized for not having name, you know, demographics, race, ethnicity, until you have that date of engagement. All right. Oh, and apologies, I should show us what 9B looks like. So now, oh, that didn't work. I should have a person here for engaged, except it's not recognizing that because I don't have a contact for them. Inconsistent data entry is not going to get us the results we want. So again, I can see that there's information missing for Roderick from up here in like the 6 tables, 6A, B, C, D, E tables. And so I know that I need to work on their profile.
Andrea, there's a question in the chat. If we realize that maybe our date of engagement was incorrect, should we go back to project start and remove it? Or what is the best guidance on correcting those potential errors around date of engagement?
Yeah, great question. Yes, that would be great. We definitely want to work for accurate information. So if date of engagement was entered on the first contact at project start and you realize, oh no, it was actually 7 days after, you can go to the project start and remove that question. Yeah, I just wanted to double check one of the outcomes.
Also, if it was entered on interim instead, you can remove it through the interim, because if it was after your start, then it won't show on your start assessment, and you'd have to remove it on an interim that was on or after the date that you entered it. So just an FYI, if you don't see it on start, don't freak out. Go to the interim that you added it on or after that date, and you can see it there and remove it.
Exactly, yeah. So actually, if we go to our client here, I think I added it on an interim. Yes, because it was just quickly today. So if I go to where I added it, went to that interim update, click the pencil, click save and continue. And apologies. Ooh, lots of missing information for Roderick. So. All right, here we go. So now I can scroll down to where that question is. And this is where the history bar becomes really important. So if you entered this, and definitely you have to be in your EDA mode in order to see this, you can remove information by clicking the trash bin. So just to review that again, I see my question with date of engagement. I see this color bar. I hover over it. It tells me how old the response is. I click the hover bar, color bar, and can remove it with this trash bin icon. Now, if you click yes here, it's gone forever, right? We can't get it back. So really don't overuse this feature. But if you are doing these corrections, you can remove that. And we'll go down here and save that so we can see. Nope, okay. Got to save and exit before I see the change. But now I should be able to go back in and, oh, I'm sorry. Because this is a big project, I have all of the options turned on. Okay, and if I scroll all the way down to our day of engagement, now it's blank. And so this is really great because this is totally removed as opposed to overwriting it, right? Because if you overwrite something, the previous answer is still there and will still flag as engaged on that date. All right. Does anyone want to see some of the workflow in action for adding a date of engagement to another client who's already been contacted multiple times? Definitely do that. Okay, let's go through and just show that for. I'm going to go to my client Marcus. I'm going to do live data entry for today. So I'm just going to use current system day. I see here he's got a lot of his information on the client profile tab. I don't need to update that. If I scroll down, I see some good contact information. If I can add some more, even better. Possible he's got minutes on a new number, or part-time job. Putting in a little description there. We can save that, and there it is. All of those contacts there. Sorry, contact information, and the most recent is up top. So hopefully that's the most accurate. Okay, so nothing to update on the client profile tab. My client Marcus is an individual. We're serving him alone, so there's no household tab. But we haven't had a privacy conversation yet, so now I can record that. This is our day of engagement, so we've had that privacy conversation. And we're going to say that he did consent to being able to be searched. That's standard section 1 information in the ROI, and he's interested in those community referrals and coordination. So it's also consented to section 2 for HMIS visibility. We've been keeping our distance, so we've been doing verbal consent. And witness is not required, but it's really helpful sometimes to just say, who had this conversation? All right, so we've got that, and we are talking about street outreach here. Apologies. Hurt your eyes. Okay, we should have one street outreach enrollment. So now it's the date of engagement. I can go and add the meeting that we have, our contact. And I'm going to go here and update. I'm going to really focus in on the current living situation. Make sure that that information is up to date. Okay. Oh my goodness, there's some missing information here. No worries, I'm going to make sure that is cleaned up on project start. All right, so I've got my date of engagement and I've got my current living situation. Just going to snapshot. It's valid for today, today only. So right now, the current living situation is a place not meant for habitation. We've got a ton of options here. I think there's 31, 33, something like that. For street outreach, you're really going to be sticking to these top sections probably. Place not meant for habitation being one. Living situation verified by, this is that lookup field we talked about. And here we're going to just search for our agency name. And I don't even have to type in the whole thing. I do a couple letters of the second word and I'm able to find that. And so here I've got my heading home in Rowan, Street Outreach Project. I'm going to select that with the green plus sign. All right. Nothing else here is required for our unsheltered clients. If it helps, you can definitely say no here. There's not category 2 homeless. I'm not being forced to leave. I am unsheltered. I am literally, or sorry, my client is unsheltered and therefore literally homeless. We've got now our layering and that history of housing situation. It's becoming more and more robust here. And we've got our date of engagement safe. We have added contact information here in the update assessment, so you can add more information if you need to here. And then potentially if I was able to do the VIs for that, which I would assume was near the date of engagement, if not before, you can add that score. And if you do a VIs for that, that's an assessment for coordinated entry, so you're going to want to enter that as well. All right, so as appropriate, we're going to fill out those updates. And then because it's my date of engagement and I am a street outreach project right now, I can actually go and fill in missing information in the project start. This is a unique power for our street outreach projects. So here on the start page, I'm going to look at, okay, what's missing? What have we talked about? Marcus and I have talked about disabling condition. He's not identifying any disabling condition.
Real quick, Andrea, there is a question in the chat of after engagement, do we need to be updating living situation every time we see someone or only if it changes?
Great question. So definitely if it changes, absolutely. And HUD's expectation is that yes, living situation should be updated after date of engagement. So again, those key situations that HUD identifies is when a street outreach worker meets with a client to discuss referral options, to assess basic needs or meet basic needs, and meet with the client about well-being. About a housing plan, like in the office. So those are significant meetings with an outreach worker. And then again, best practice is at least once a month, minimum 3 months. So you may not have the capacity. Yeah.
And just a little bit more context, the current living situation is replacing what outreach used to use as a contact. So previously outreach did a data element that was called contact that you recorded every time you met with someone. Current living situation is taking the place of that. So you can think of the current living situation as needing to be filled out every single time you have a contact with that person, and not just when their current living situation has changed. Because that's, if you look at that report, or if you remember the caper that Andrea, she didn't add that contact, and so they didn't show up as having a contact. So in that contact field of counting those contacts, they're going to pull that current living situation into that. So if they stayed in the same location, but you had 20 contacts that you didn't record with a current living situation each of those 20 times, you kind of not getting counted for those 20 contacts that you made with them, if that makes sense, right? So even if the current living situation is the same and doesn't necessarily change, it is how you are recording that you're having a contact with someone for your workflow and for recording purposes. I guess that also helps frame how often and when that should be completed.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And we actually saw it in that caper, right? When Roderick had a date of engagement and didn't have a current living situation, he wasn't seen as fully engaged because of that conflict. So current living situation, recording these contacts is really important to make sure that you get the credit for doing this important work and engagement.
Andrea, I'm wondering, since you're on the START assessment, if you do want to touch on those homeless history questions. Most of them generally are, a prior living situation, and generally that's before, before we start meeting with folks and have, that date before. How is it that they should be filling that information out for outreach on a date of engagement that might be after their start date?
Absolutely. Thank you for that excellent planted question. So the homeless history is going to really refer to the project start date. And so if you can work with the client to figure out, okay, well, back when we first met, what was your situation? How long had you been there? That's going to be the conversation you want to have to complete this, and fill out likely prior living situation is going to be a place not meant for habitation, but it might have been something else. You might have met them, their first night on the streets, what the length of time was in that place, and then approximately what's the date that they began that experience of literal homelessness on the streets or in shelter. So this is on the project start assessment, so this is referring to the project start date.
Another question in chat: if the current living situation during a contact is somewhere sheltered, like a friend's couch, but we know it'll only be for the night, would we still record it that way and then update it back to place not meant for human habitation the next time we have contact? I do think in some of this question is probably eligibility considerations, right? If folks are staying with friends, they might be considered housed, and if not, then it also might be some good information to give around like those pieces as well.
Right. So be aware of when your eligibility checks are, but predominantly that's going to be at project start, right, at the beginning of your relationship with the client. So it is okay, and you would want to make sure that you update that to place not meant for habitation next time, because you want to make sure that if you're accurately representing their homeless history, right? So throughout your engagement, you want to make sure they're getting the right homeless history accounted for. Do you have anything to add, Nicole?
No, I think that's right. I think I know that we're all thinking about eligibility with our grants, right? And that's totally reasonable. But like Andrea said, it's really those eligibility checkpoints that would be really impactful for. So, if at start they're staying on a friend's couch, maybe they aren't at that point, the most appropriate person to enroll in your outreach program. And maybe when they contact you when they're not staying on their friend's couch anymore in another week or whenever that is, and that's when you start engaging with them. So that is something I think to think about. But what we want this current living situation to be, and you saw at this point on those capers and APRs, it's just pulling the number of contacts. It's not necessarily pulling where people are. We don't necessarily foresee that happening. So it's on current living situation at least. And so at this point, it's really just counting those contacts. Now you are using current living situation, ideally in case conferencing and those kinds of things for coordinated entry to know where folks are at. But it being changed to a friend's couch for a week and then changed back for a place not meant for human habitation shouldn't really impact eligibility very much. And also, like Andrea said, gives a better reflection of their homeless history of where they were staying at what points in time. That way, when you do go to verify homelessness, let's say for a place that requires chronic homelessness or anything else, you have that in-depth information, right? You can say, oh yeah, like they do have 4 episodes because they were staying with friends or family for these periods of time. And so then it's those episodes, you know, add up over time and that kind of a thing too. So, so it is giving you a nice homeless history. Yeah, and then you can see Andrea showing this. It's really just looking at those first contacts for where folks were staying.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I just thought that was a really good point. Wanted to show us exactly where that is. So in the report, this is, you know, the report designed by HUD. They're really looking at first contact as that kind of proxy for eligibility. So, and I don't believe that Street Outreach has an eligibility check-in down the line, like homeless prevention and other projects. I think Rapid Rehousing has one too. But those would be the key points that I would be aware of for eligibility. And if they're no longer eligible, then it's appropriate for an exit, right? Yeah, but there's a lot of variation in the client's experience of unsheltered homelessness.
Yeah, I think that is one of the nice things about current living situation. Yes, it is data entry work to go in there and add it every single time, but I think historically we have missed some of that richness in the reality, right? Like HMIS has not been able to adequately reflect folks' actual homelessness experience before. Yes, you can see the shelters that they stayed at, but when they're not staying at an HMIS participating shelter, you don't necessarily see that, right? Like so and now it's definitely not going to be perfect, right? But it does give us a better gauge of folks' homeless journey. And I'm hoping that's how HUD uses that data element over time, especially for folks who are unsheltered, because I think the reality is even for unsheltered folks and folks that are, you know, using emergency shelter and accessing other services, sometimes they do get to stay in a friend's house, or sometimes they do get to stay with a family member, or sometimes somebody does pay for a hotel for them for 3 nights, right? Like that's just the reality. And so this being able to reflect that better, I think will help us better know how to interact and support folks that are experiencing homelessness as we use and have this data a little bit more and can actually reflect their actual journey versus, you know, the few touch points that we have where we're asking about some of those things.
Absolutely, well said. We, you know, always looking for this information to be more and more accurate in the system, better reflect, you know, the experience of clients, the efforts we're making, the successful outcomes, and ultimately, you know, the ways that we can end people's experience of homelessness. All right. Let's see. Any other questions that we have? I will then just show us briefly again where you can find those resources. On our website, it's the admin website, so if you go to ncceh.org, Data Center and HMIS. We've got that administrative document site. And then here, there's two sets of important documents. There's our privacy guidance documents, which includes, everything we talked about in terms of what to bring to your meeting and your field work, as well as items like the options one pager that helps describe, what are the key decision points that clients have to make. And then further down, we've got the data collection forms. This is for all project types, but especially our services only street outreach. We've got that here. You may find the full START assessment form to be really helpful to know exactly what's needed by date of engagement. But you can also use these supplemental forms for first outreach contact and then additional outreach contact. So all of this will be really helpful, not only for your project, your funded project, maybe attaining funding, right? Getting that funding if you want to demonstrate this data collection and entry, and then also for coordinated entry and making sure that we're giving appropriate access to coordinated entry to folks experiencing unsheltered homelessness. If you do get stuck, there's some resources on our training page, including some PDF guides under the other resources section. And we've got them all laid out here for street outreach, basic workflow, the HMIS steps, and data elements. All right. Well, that is the content for us. So if you do have any other questions, you're very welcome to reach out to us at hmis@ncch.org. We've been having a little phone trouble, but you can also leave us a message there, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. Really appreciate everyone coming out today, and keep those questions coming. Y'all had really good questions today. Thanks so much.